Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Duarte, and I am here with Dr. Kristen Allett and our guests for this webinar on recognizing and addressing addictions in the time of COVID-19. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Webinar is being provided for educational purposes only, so nothing here constitutes specific advice or treatment plans, and we encourage you to seek your local providers if you need something more individualized for yourself. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Kristen Allett.
Thank you. So I'm so excited to have such an amazing group of panelists to come and join. When Natasha and I decided to start adding guests to the Connectors meeting, I thought of these three lovely women and was unsure if they would join, and they all said yes. And so I'm just so excited. So the purpose for today is to help people recognize it and get some information on if they think that they're starting to develop an addiction, because this time of isolation is a great time for the brain to wire in some addictive patterns. And so I've asked our guests to bring three different perspectives, and so we'll talk about those three different perspectives and tools towards addictions. But I'm going to have them introduce themselves and their title just really briefly, and then give a little information about why I'm excited for them, just so you can hear their voices. And then they're going to do a little longer 5-minute summary for their unique perspective. I want to say this is not their only perspective. They've just offered to hold this perspective for this meeting. So our first guest that I would really like to introduce is Ambrosia Eberhardt, and from Spokane. And so what's your current position that you want people to know? And
well, I am the Spokane Parents for Parents Program Manager and transitioning to a new role as the Family Impact Manager over all Parents for Parents program throughout the state with Children's Home Society.
And can you just tell us a little bit about Parents for Parents, because a lot of people don't have any.
So the Parents for Parents program is designed to use parents that have lived child welfare experience to help other parents currently navigating a child welfare case. And we do that through educational classes that we teach and facilitate. We provide resources, connect parents to different needs they might need. We meet them at their first court hearing and at subsequent hearings, and we provide peer support.
Great.
Like over the phone mentoring.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then I was going to invite Andrea to introduce herself and where she's coming from, but her video, oh, there she is.
I'm
okay.
here. Okay. I'm sorry, I just had to let the beloved dog in because she was looking so mournfully at my door. So, yes, I am Andrea St. Clair, and I am the client care coordinator at A Positive Alternative, which is an outpatient treatment program in Seattle that offers an alternative. It's well-versed in the 12-step model, but I've added something to those who may have that as a foundation that are looking for some evidence-based new skills and tools to learn, or for those where they know the 12-step model is not the right fit for them. And I do help people get placed in inpatient treatment programs, other programs outside of ours, if ours is not the right fit, with finding therapists, psychiatrists, naturopaths, etc.
Yeah. And as a full disclosure, I was the wellness director for about 10 years at A Positive Alternative. And so I am a big fan of the program. And then I want to introduce Alida, Schuyler.
Hi there. I'm Alida Schuyler, and I'm owner and director of Crossroads Recovery Coaching, and someone that has just read and studied addiction more or less obsessively for the last 30 plus years.
And how I am connected to Alida is that I consider her one of my main mentors in addictions. She's a phenomenal resource on helping people navigate and get through and get some relief from addictions. But what I also really appreciate about Alida is that she really comes from a strengths-based model of helping people figure out what they personally need. And although I haven't done her recovery coaching, the people who I've met who have gone through her training program are amazing recovery coaches. So we have some really great resources. Ambrosia today has offered to talk about the 12-step perspective, or 12-step programs that are available. Andrea is going to talk about when people should consider inpatient or outpatient recovery, and maybe we'll touch a little bit on that there are alternatives to 12-step. And then Alida is going to talk about harm reduction, which is a really important and fairly new part of the discussion of treating and helping people with addictions. And so they're each going to give about a 5-minute little insert about that. And then we're going to I have some questions for them so you can hear some comparison contrast. And then we're going to hopefully have time for Q&A. Ambrosia, would you mind sort of kicking us off and give us some information about what 12-step is and how it might play into addiction, help with addictions, and so that people can just know a little more about that?
Yeah, so there's lots of different branches of 12-step, 12-step options out there for people, depending on like what might work best for them if they choose that. I know there's like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, there's Overeaters Anonymous, Gambling Anonymous, Sex Anonymous. I know there's so many more.
Marijuana Anonymous.
Marijuana Anonymous, right. And then there's like also 12-step for people who might have grew up with parents that were experiencing times in addiction. I'm trying to remember all those, like adult children of alcoholics, Al-Anon, Al-Anon, like there is, there's a whole gamut of help out there for people. I am a person who participates in a 12-step program locally. And how that has been, how I feel like for myself that is helpful is not only does it give me some camaraderie with people that might be struggling with similar things, it also gives me access to people who might have went through things that I might face, and I could get suggestions on ways to navigate that. It gives me something to be accountable to. I get to choose a sponsor for myself and work the steps, which is really just an unlayering of where I was, where I don't want to continue being, maybe unlayering some trauma and why I might find myself using something outside of myself to change the way I feel. For me, it's really helped with growing into a new person and kind of cleaning up the wreckage of my past and noticing my patterns. I'm also somebody that sought outside help. So I needed a counselor to untangle some of that trauma as well. And I continue to gain freedom from that. And I see that work for a number of people. I think it's really important that before COVID, we used to hug because, that releases that oxytocin, I think it's called, right? If we have a long hug with somebody. And I feel like when I'm coming out of an addiction, I need more of that than ever. And it's going to be really weird to come back together and be like, I don't know if I want to hug yet, I'll hug within my family. But there's also
you still get oxytocin just getting together with a safe group.
Boom, Boom. See, I didn't know that.
Boom.
Okay. Well,
Part
see,
of my groups are so important.
yeah. I also know there's like 12 steps that are that include faith-based stuff for people. So celebrate recovery options out there. Yeah.
So since we're not going to meetings anymore, have 12-step moved online?
Yes.
Yes.
So a really interesting thing that is kind of blowing me away, and I hope in some way post-COVID, we continue to do some platforms online through Zoom, because I haven't done this yet, but I've seen other people doing it. I could choose to hop on a Scotland meeting, for example, and participate in their meeting online in my little Spokane apartment and just have a completely different perspective. And it's so cool to do that. Or, it's posted online. So like locally here anyways, one would search AA Spokane and go to the meeting schedule, and it would show you all the Zoom links, so you can just join. Same with NA, it's nuwana.org, and there's all kinds of Zoom meetings at scheduled times, and you can just hop on one. So I also can hop on ones that I normally wouldn't be able to have access to, because of driving there or whatever. It's just, that's kind of cool. I have seen that be both a good thing and a hard thing. It kind of really, much like Dr. Allett and I had talked about a couple of weeks ago, I have post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this isolation, I am thriving. But that is not the experience I'm seeing like universally across the board with people experiencing some time in addiction. I know like relapse is up, and the hugs and the in-person connection has people struggling, and they're looking forward to meetings in person again.
Yeah. And for people who are wondering if alcohol or marijuana or something has gotten into their brain and is in charge of it, like it's a resource that they can reach out to right now.
Yes,
right?
It's a resource you could reach out to right now, and like a person doesn't have to decide before they hop on a Zoom meeting, like, am I an addict? Am I an alcoholic? Is marijuana, am I overusing marijuana? A person could just hop on and be like, I'm exploring if this might be right for me.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
That's okay.
I don't get to choose. I don't get to tell anyone label anyone. That's for the individual to explore and decide for themselves.
Yeah. So great. So thanks for that brief summary. We're going to go a little deeper in a few minutes, but I'm going to move on. We're going to move on to Andrea, who's going to tell us a little bit about outpatient and possibly inpatient, and who would think about doing that and why, and
Sure.
And what maybe a little bit to what to look for.
Yes, well, did you want me to touch on how you would recognize a pattern, or because
we're going to do that with the Q&A.
We'll do that after. Okay. So I would say the way I usually characterize it, and it's often during that first phone call, I can begin to ascertain the magnitude of the problem. Is this something that can be safely addressed on an outpatient basis? Or does this person need a higher level of care? And of course, there are all kinds of, diagnostic criteria and ways of ascertaining that through ASAM and that kind of thing. But I'm just deeply listening, and I'm bearing those things in mind. And I'll often explain to people, I give a little analogy like, well, going to an inpatient program is kind of like if you wanted to learn a foreign language and you went to an immersion program, so that you're immersed in that 24/7, you're living and breathing recovery work around the clock, and you have support around the clock. So it's a very structured environment. It's cloistered, it's safe. So if someone, for example, is living in a home where they really won't be able to be substance free, or they just can't stop long enough to get into an outpatient program, then an inpatient program would be indicated. And then I also say to people, and this is my philosophy, that where the rubber hits the road is when you come home from that, because when you're spared your daily stressors, when your environment is very contained and controlled, when you have help around the clock, it's quite different. And then you come back home. And so I feel that the aftercare piece is crucial. And it's a piece that doesn't always get addressed well when someone's leaving an inpatient program. And I think it's really critical. So the more solid that is, the better the outcome for that individual. So I encourage people really to step right into a good solid aftercare program that can include, and probably ideally, an intensive outpatient program, sober support meetings that work for them, and just having a great kind of safety net for when they come home.
So if somebody opts to go inpatient for, and usually it's about 28 to 40 days, but there are longer programs out there depending on often the level of trauma that is behind the addictive pattern. So then they could come home to a plan that could include a structured outpatient. So that's like a organization that is structuring the classes for that person, or they could go into the anonymous and free 12-step program.
Yeah, I really recommend both. And there are a lot of sober support meetings that are not 12-step oriented for those who are interested. We have, like up here in Washington State, we have Northwest Buddhist Recovery. There's been Refuge Recovery. Those are mindfulness oriented, Buddhist oriented. There's Smart Recovery. That's a kind of a more rational approach for those where the 12-step meetings are not. People also do a combination of all of these. And that's another, I would say, bonus of being in an intensive outpatient program is you can explore a lot of those resources while you're getting adequate help. And I would say ideally, if people can do that, that's the best combination.
So we'll put links to all of those alternatives that we can get our hands on in the blog, the post notes, because I think it's important to have lots of different options to explore depending on what your preference is. But I think that I think knowing the spectrum of services out there is really helpful for people taking the step forward to see if they want to address it.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would add to that is again, personal bias, think it's crucial to have family involved, if there is family, so that they're getting support and education and information so that they can most effectively support their loved one while taking good care of themselves. So there's Al-Anon when we're talking about the 12-step model, and then CRAFT is really great. And Smart Recovery offers a friends and family free support group, but they're working through a workbook. It's often facilitated by a therapist. And because that's the other thing about leaving inpatient and then you step back into your system. And if not everyone in that system has been getting help, that can be very challenging.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we're going to hear about harm reduction from Alida.
Hi there. So before I just say anything, I'll just say I'm one of those people that loves 12-step and loves harm reduction. And so, because a lot of times you get sort of pinned in a box that says, oh, if you're harm reduction, then you don't like 12 steps and vice versa. But that's not true with me. So what I like about harm reduction, one is that it's very honest, it's compassionate, it's kind. There's a nice video on YouTube called Transformations. If you type in harm reduction and transformations, there's a nice hour-long thing, and you'll get a tour of New York harm reduction people doing all sorts of things. But one of the reasons that I think harm reduction is a missing piece is because, as it is now, the 12-step programs are all abstinence-based. And abstinence is not really the first, people aren't typically ready for abstinence when they first think they might have a problem. But there's very, very little help for people early along. I wanted to learn how to drink properly starting at age 11 and spent years trying to figure out how to drink properly. If I had had anybody who knew anything about harm reduction, I would have gotten some information that could have been helpful to me. I also think some of the things that I chose to do before I knew that word were actually harm reduction oriented, and in many ways may have saved my life. So harm reduction these days, people associate it with needle exchanges and that kind of thing, but they really aren't necessarily drug oriented. They also do work with sex workers and all kinds of things that can cause harm. Let's see. So it has both a really huge public health aspect where they're working on policy and drug laws and all of that kind of thing. And in the last 20 years or so, harm reduction psychotherapy has been developed. So one-on-one models of working with somebody. One of the things I like about them is they recognize that addiction occurs in a context, and they think that context is important. And so if you want to come in and talk about your home or your family or your spouse or your mate, or they're saying you don't even have to talk about drugs. We will help you however you want help. And so, to find a woman who is saying, my man shoots me up every day, but I want to learn how to do it myself because I don't like being dependent on him in that way. Well, there are not very many places that are willing to do that kind of thing, but that's the sort of thing that they would do. Because they want people to shoot up safely if they're going to use IV drugs. So there's a great deal of emphasis on all of the things that you can do to be safer. One of the concepts that I think is fairly simple is one of the early things that came out in the 1960s. It's Zinberg's model of setting, and drug. And so this was 60s, Haight-Ashbury, beginning to try to help people not flip out when they took drugs, or recognize that there's a big difference between speed, as it was called then, methamphetamines and marijuana. But setting and drugs. So SET stood for mindset. It's about, are you in a good mood? Do you have any pre-existing conditions that might get in the way of your having a successful experience with this drug? So all the things that are unique to that individual would come under SET. It used to stand for mindset. Then there's setting. Where are you using? With whom are you taking drugs? Are you drinking in an alley or shooting up in an alley? If you are, chances are you're not going to use the safety precautions that you might do at home. You might not clean your kit or your injection site if you're trying to get high before the police find you. And then the other is the drug itself. And so I think nicotine's a good example. Nicotine can be taken through cigarettes, vaping, chewing gum, patches, and lozenges. And there's a difference in how safe those are. Mm-hmm. So it's just basically saying to try see if you can make the best choices that you can given the drugs that you're using.
So as an example, going back to alcohol, which I think is going to be used in larger quantities in this moment, is drinking 3% cider beer is different than drinking vodka.
Absolutely. Different blood alcohol. I mean, you'll have different blood alcohol levels drinking, those two different things. One's going to get you drunk much more quickly than the other.
And the vodka will be a lot more dangerous because of that.
It depends on what you're thinking about. I mean, I thought wine was dangerous because it had the worst hangover. So I thought vodka was better than wine because I didn't get a hangover. So it just depends on how you look at it.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to add before we kind of move to?
No, I think we can move.
Okay, awesome. So those are some overviews, and so we're going to do in the same order. But I have 3 questions that I want each of the panelists to have a chance to answer, and I'm happy to read it 3 times just for the panelists. But we'll start with Ambrosia. How do you recognize when the brain is starting to wire in a pattern of addiction? May that be for alcohol, drugs, screens, online shopping, exercise, sugar or overeating, porn, hoarding, etc. And I just want to stop. So some people are like, because the question often gets phrased, well, how do I know if I have an addiction? And I think that the research out there is really clear that addictions are a brain disorder. And so I really want to name that it's not a person disorder, that it's a brain disorder. We say that I broke my femur. We don't say I'm broken when we come back from skiing, right? We're not completely broken as a person. And it's the same with addictions. It's that the brain is using a substance or a behavior in a way to modify emotions. And so, but like how as a person might you recognize that pattern's starting, and that you might want to be curious about it. So Ambrosia.
Yeah, so I can tell you I have this thing where I feel like when I've relapsed before, I relapsed in behaviors way before I ever picked the drug or alcohol back up. And so cues for me to know that I'm kind of heading that way is I'm not taking care of myself in the same way that I have been. I might cuss more. That's kind of a cue to maybe reach out and get some support. My daughter's like, you're a little off the hook, Mom. I might be experiencing sleep issues. I'm not eating right. I'm really going to that sugar, like I'm obsessing over it. When my thoughts are consumed by something outside of myself a huge percentage of the time, and I'm seeking ways to numb myself, that's like a danger cue for me. I currently have this email thing that tells me how much time I'm spending doing certain things, and that can be a great cue about my online behavior.
Yeah.
Because I can also use screen time too much. Of course, in this pandemic, I'm going to give myself the kindness that, of course, I'm on screens too much right now. Another cue for me, and I don't know, like
somebody's still
see this in parents, I kind of just start to see their behaviors and choices and thought patterns, like kind of going back to some older stuff when maybe I had seen them reaching a different level, and it's just kind of, but I mean, some of this can happen that, and it doesn't mean that we're going to end up drinking or using or.
Yeah. So if I'm stuck at home and let's say I've been a social drinker my whole life, and like 2 or 3 days a week, I would have a couple of glasses of wine. And now I'm having wine every night and a couple of glasses and maybe sometimes a bottle because like I'm at home. No designated driver problem, right?
Yeah.
And I was seeing those behaviors that you were talking about when you were sober, but you were starting to lean back towards using again. Do you think that applies to the person? Because sometimes people don't think that substance is causing the lack of sleep and the yelling at their kids and their, because that was last night.
Yeah. So I'm not like the substance use disorder professional.
No.
I know there's some kind of a scoring that happens. I might be saying this incorrectly, that kind of indicates like, is our home life being negatively affected by our increase in drinking? Is there legal stuff going on now? Is there, work issues happening? Like I'm not showing up to work on time. I just got rode up. Like, yeah, I feel like those could be indicators that I might want to explore. Like, could this be I'm over drinking or, could have.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you give both perspectives, and I kind of pulled you into that second perspective, but that like that watching the texture of your life is a really good indicator if you're doing okay.
Yeah.
And
if I haven't smoked in a year and I'm all of a sudden smoking, I at least would want to know, like, where did something recently happen that triggered me? Why am I reaching for this nicotine? Or during this thing, like, I hadn't had sugar for 2 years, right? That was a path I was on. I have had donuts a few times. And what was the other thing? I don't remember. There was something else with sugar in it. So like, I'm even experiencing a backwards into some old behaviors during this lockdown and COVID, and access to, this not as healthy of foods, even though I'm home and theoretically could be making the healthiest of foods. I'm not making those choices all the time. So I'm relapsing on sugar currently, intermittently.
And I appreciate that you're like, look at that. That's happening. And, like there's curiosity about it and not a lot of judgment, right?
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's the other thing that I think shows up, is the judgment really starts going when there's something we're unconscious about.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to ask Andrea the same question. When somebody calls into you, like, how do you recognize if they might have, like, if they're sort of, their brain's starting to get into the pattern of addiction versus, like, is this a problem? Or, like, how do you suss that out? Like, what are you curious about?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when you asked the question, I was just reflecting a little and thinking, well, not every person who's exposed to a substance or tries a substance develops a problem with it.
Right.
But I know from interviewing, countless people, that it's often described like, wow, my brain just lit up when I tried that, or that's the first time in my life I felt normal, or, like, I remember it with myself. I was 15, I was having eye surgery, and they gave me a shot of Demerol, and I went, oh my gosh, this is the best I have ever felt. Now, not everybody would feel that way, and some people feel horrible from that, but I think that tells us, and they've done all those studies, like with Vietnam vets who were using opiates in Vietnam, but they came home and they were fine, most of them, so there is something unique, I think, about particular brains. And we also at A Positive Alternative call it a form of dangerously misguided self-care, which to me implies we have these very legitimate needs. Most of us haven't had an opportunity. I call the program going to grad school for your inner life, because most of us didn't get to learn, well, how do I take care of myself on the inside? How do I face, we know stress is the number one trigger, but painful emotions, trauma history, anxiety, depression, all these things, so that people are doing the best they can to feel better and to manage. So when I'm talking with people, I'll often say, I've come to think of, I'll just use alcohol in this example, as a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it will promise you, like, feeling a little anxious, I'm an anti-anxiety. Feeling down, I'm an antidepressant. Can't sleep, I'm a sleep aid. And then in fact, we know, well, it's acting as a depressant on the brain. You can have a big kickback of increased anxiety. And while you may fall asleep or pass out, you'll have disrupted sleep. So it's that, Amy, our wonderful supervisor, who Kristen knows, calls alcohol a jealous lover that wants you all to itself. And I would say those are the things, to start to notice, like, well, am I thinking about this, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at work, and I'm really anticipating it and I can't wait to get home? That preoccupation, that, is it affecting my job performance, but I'm still doing it? All those kind of criteria type questions. But I would say, if that's become an area of real preoccupation and anticipation, I think there's kind of a trance state, and the brain chemistry is changing even before you ingest the substance or do the behavior, because you're just looking so forward to it that your brain chemistry is already changing. So I think that's all in keeping with your philosophy of what's going on in the brain.
Yeah, thank you. How about Alida? Do you have anything that you want to add, or how do you?
Yeah, I do. So there, Richard Feynman, who is a physicist and won the Nobel Peace Prize, or one of those big prizes, I can't remember which one. In the middle, in this book, he's got 2 lines. He used to go into bars and sit and work on his things he was working on, workout, lots of math equations. He said, and one day he was walking down the street and he got the urge to go in a bar, and he's like, why? I don't have a notebook with me. That was the last time he decided to never have another drink, because he recognized that was coming from a different place in his brain. So it was some years before I heard about corticotryptin factor. We've got a brain that probably starts at a deficit. If you've had trauma, you probably have a deficit of neurotransmitters to begin with. You take a drug, it's like, oh my God, this is the best thing. I mean, my body thinks speed is the best thing. It thinks opioids are the best thing, alcohol is the best thing, and marijuana is the best thing. It really does. And what I know is when the brain actually has what it needs, it doesn't have cravings. But what happens is when addiction sets in, they call it flipping a switch. You start getting corticotryptin factor released, and corticotryptin factor increases cravings and increases risk. And so what I know is it's coming from an addictive place. If it isn't a conscious choice that I've made, if it's like, oh, I just saw a billboard and now I'm salivating, that's not really coming from anywhere but my limbic system. So addiction's wired into that part of your brain, which is what's so hard about it. It's not coming from, your cerebral cortex, and your cerebral cortex isn't going, well, I think what I'll do tonight is have this. Most of those urges and cravings are coming from a whole different place, which is what makes it very, very hard to do anything about it until you're already in trouble, I would say.
Yeah, that's that I love all those perspectives. That, I think that gives us lots of information to just be curious about what might be happening for ourselves as things arise. Thank you so much. So the second question that I want to hear from all of you is that if a person is beginning to suspect that they have a problem, where do they reach out for help? And some of this was sort of mentioned in your intros, but I want to be really specific. Like, here is somebody sitting at home, and the part of their cortex, their curious part of their cortex, is saying, I might need help, and I'm stuck at home. And I have the internet, but it's overwhelming. Like, what is one or two concrete steps that somebody who's just, every part of their brain except for this one little piece of territory is going, don't do it, and everything else is like, maybe. And how would they reach out for the next help? And it might be, here's a site, or here's a book, or like, what would you say to that person who's just like in that moment? And we're going to have Ambrosia go first again.
Okay. So I interestingly just literally Googled, like, how would I know if I thought I might be experiencing an addiction? And Psychology Today has a really good 6 signs that might be where a person is sitting. And it's interesting that it kind of talks about the reward response. Does it, much like was talked about by one of the other, oh my gosh, I don't remember which one of you beautiful ladies said it, but does this make me feel better? Do I feel more in control? Do I now all of a sudden feel normal? I remember the first time I did meth and I did it intravenously, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel normal, which was really scary and led me to very dark places. It also talks about on here, has it disrupted my life and relationships? And I know we've already kind of talked about that.
So how would somebody get to a 12-step group?
Oh, so to get to a 12-step group, here in Spokane anyways, I would just Google Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, then my city, and it should pop up that area's site, and you would click on it and click on meeting schedule, and it should list all the meetings that are available in somebody's area. Some of those might be very large and vast and meetings going on all the time, and for smaller areas it might be once or twice a week.
And am I going to find links to these Zoom meetings? Because
yes.
so
like
it's all there.
Yep. The ones that are doing Zoom now, not every single meeting that exists is on the online platform right now, but a lot are. And literally you open up that meeting schedule that usually would just give you the details to go in person, where the address is, you know, some of the, whether it was an hour-and-a-half meeting, whether or not you can bring kids or whatever. Now it's just literally the Zoom link and you click on it, and you know, if it's at that time, so like a 7 p.m. women's meeting, I would click on it, it's 7 p.m. and it would take me right into the meeting.
Now, am I going to have to put my real name?
No, you could sign that. No, you could sign that up and put, you know, Dynamic Brains if you wanted to.
And am I going to have to turn on my video?
No, actually, you can call in and not do a video and do it completely anonymous.
So I don't have to say anything?
No.
I could just listen.
Mm-hmm. Now, I will caution that sometimes there are meeting formats where they do something called a tag, where they will then, you know, tag people to talk. Thankfully, I have not seen that platform used a lot anymore, because I feel like—
But I could just say iPad. Like,
oh, thank you. Yep,
I'm new and I don't really want to talk to anybody.
Just here exploring.
That would be respected.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank
Okay.
you, but no thank you.
Okay. Awesome. And then Andrea, sorry. If I wanted to go to an inpatient or outpatient program, should I just get online and find something online?
I think that's a little risky, as I pointed out earlier, because most websites look good. So I think it's helpful if you can find kind of a point person, somebody like me, or an interventionist, or even a person's own physician or therapist. I would say, you know, the referrals we get come from people finding us online. So that certainly can be a good way to, you know, make an initial contact, and from therapists and physicians. And so, you know, if your doctor knows and recommends a program to you, you can probably rely on that it's probably reputable and clinically sound.
So they'll have your contact information. We can post that.
Absolutely, because I'm always happy to help anybody find a good direction to go in.
And then we can also post, is there credentialing around interventionists? Or is there an organization? There's an organization, I believe.
There's some different resources of like consultants who will help with that, who are knowledgeable, case manager organizations who will help you find viable treatment, solid treatment. I have, you know, a couple of colleagues who I turn to on a regular basis, run it by them, and, you know, make sure.
We'll put together some contacts that will post notes. So if somebody's sitting there and being like, I think I really want to do inpatient right now because this is getting, and I like the idea of like just doing it 24 hours 7 and getting really educated on it, they can contact it, or in finding local outpatient programs.
Right, and there are treatment placement specialists. So, you know, someone could contact me and I could direct them to those people who can help them and explore and look at all the elements, you know, like, is the program, like I said, number one, clinically sound? Is it financially feasible? Does it resonate with that person's own philosophy? You know, help them ascertain all those points. Do an insurance benefit estimate for them, all those kinds of things.
And I'm going to have to agree, because what I have had some programs that I've really liked referring to for a while, and then I refer and then people come back and I'm like, what is, you know, and so programs change. So I think I really agree with you in that, like, somebody who's knowledgeable about what the status of the programs are currently is really the best place to get into an outpatient or inpatient program.
Yeah. And if you have an advocate like that, someone who's helping you locate and get admitted to this program, or a treatment placement specialist, then they can follow through that whole treatment episode and make sure that the quality of care is on board and the person's getting the services that they were promised. And I think that's very helpful. I think in our whole medical world in general, it's very good to have an advocate.
Yep. And then Alida, is anything else?
Oh, I was just going to say a couple of books came to mind. One is, it's an older book, but Charlotte Castle, Many Roads, One Journey, because that gives quite a wide range. And then Sober for Good. So Charlotte Castle is Many Roads from One Journey, and then Anne Fletcher, I believe, is Sober for Good. And that actually does kind of encompass harm reduction. It gives a broad range of how someone might define their own recovery and sobriety.
Thank you. And Alida, how about you? Like, here I am clear. I do not want to do abstinence, but I am also clear that what I am currently doing is not safe or is just too much for me. Where would I start for harm reduction?
I don't know that people are going to start with harm reduction unless they've already been educated in some way. So,
well, they found this podcast.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, all I know is I wasn't willing to go anywhere until I had done a lot of reading, because that's sort of my default. I read Addictive Drinking, which it described what an AA meeting was like. If I hadn't read that book a year or two before I went to an AA meeting, I wouldn't have walked in there. Well, I might have on that particular occasion, but really. So I think a good resource that people at home during this period of time, Reddit has an amazing number of what they call subreddits. And they have one called Stop Drinking. It's probably got over 200,000 members in it. And a wide variety of people describing where they are, what they're trying to do. It is obviously a stop drinking. It's an abstinence one, but there are people who will write in and say, I've been hanging out here for 4 years and I finally had my first days without alcohol. So you can read about a lot of other people's experience. They also have subreddits. They have one called Leaves for abstinence from marijuana. They have one called Petioles, which is kind of a cannabis management, sort of more medical management of approach. I would just suggest that you really look at the lay of the land, because most people who have gotten far enough into addiction to need help don't have much of a resource network. Mm-hmm. And so that, that's the kind of thing I would say, just start somewhere and educate yourself about what your choices are.
And do you have some favorite books on harm reduction?
Well, for drinking, I love William R. Miller's Controlling Your Drinking. I wish I'd gotten it for my 12th birthday, because I would have had a completely different experience instead of trying to figure out if I should stop drinking between the 5th and the 6th drink or between the 8th and the, I would have understood that as a female, I don't process the same way men do. I shouldn't be trying to keep up with them. So that's a very good book. I like Changing for Good, which was Prochaska's first description of the stages of change. That was helpful to me even later to realize that, because in some ways, like the push is that you have to leap into action. All of a sudden, I go straight from addiction into turning my will and my life over to a 12-step program for the rest of my life and quitting. No, there's really a lot of phases that you're going to go through, chances are, before that either works or you get to that place. So understanding a change process. I think anybody who wants to work with other people in that realm could read Motivational Interviewing. It's based on the stages of change model. It's language that is helpful. And, one of the fun things in there, they said the meaner an addiction counselor is to somebody, research has shown the more that person is drinking a year out. So the hard edge of, you got to do this. Oh, that just backs people into corners, and they some of them never will come back. Yeah. So I think it's hard to find harm reduction resources unless you live in an urban area. Yeah. Every one of the students I have trained got some introduction to harm reduction. Some of them take to it and begin to see how it shows up in so many ways. Yeah. Other people, I've had people just drop out of the entire program right then and there because they think I'm anti-12 step or something because I taught them that.
If I'm somebody and the idea of harm reduction is really resonating with me, they could contact you and get information from you, or get a referral from you, or work with you.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And any of the above.
Yeah.
And the students that I've trained, some of them have interest in sex addiction. Some of them are interested in disordered eating and eating disorders. And I mean, so they have a lot of different areas in which, and so if you want somebody who works only with women, or, you know, or a man who works with men with sex addiction.
But they could contact you and you could help them find.
That's what I'm saying. I would help them find someone who does that.
Awesome. Yeah. So we have had such good information, but I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. And so I had one more question, which was just sort of tipping the scale on, does self-care count? And in terms around a protein, sleep, and exercise, and that's really you know, a very biased question. So I'm gonna let the people who have come to participate to see if they have any questions, because I want to get their questions in, and we'll go from there. So Natasha, has anybody put any questions in the chat box?
No, not yet, but feel free to go ahead and type it in. I think in part we've had such great conversation that's getting into a lot of, you know, I think really good initial questions that might be part of it. But if anyone has something that they'd like to ask, or questions about a specific approach or program, or for one of our panelists, feel free to go ahead.
In the meantime, whilst people are typing that in, Kristen, I'd like to speak to the eating, sleeping, and exercising. Okay. I think those are absolutely essential, important things for people to do if they want to experience good health and to feel good. I also think they're insufficient for many people who have used drugs, because often when you use drugs, you have damaged part of your body. People who use opioids have damaged their endocrine system. They no longer make natural endorphins anymore. They don't have much in the way of sex hormones. Some of them are going to need external sources, whether they're pharmaceutical or whatever, in order to feel anything resembling an acceptable sense of normality. People who have used amphetamines for too long. I mean, I think it was the Japanese found that 5 years later they could still find an excess of hypervigilant cells which are overmade. So, you know, I think that sometimes, and maybe alcohol is one of the easier drugs in that way. If you quit drinking genuinely, you tend to feel better, but that's not always true with other drugs. And so I just don't want people to think that they are a failure if they can't stay sober just because they're eating and exercising and sleeping now. They may need some other form of help.
Right.
That's my 2 cents worth.
Right. And what I have seen is sometimes addiction programs don't adequately address eating frequently and sleeping, getting adequate sleep, and getting exercise. It's just sort of do the program, and you spend way too much time in your limbic system.
Yeah.
I
think the whole post-acute withdrawal thing is something that's not dealt with very well. I mean, the residual effects of taking drugs aren't dealt with very well. I'll be quiet now.
Yeah.
One participant said that she wanted to share a quote: "Chance favors the prepared mind," by Louis Pasteur, and one is curious what the panelists think of that. And then I'll just read the second question. The second question is whether there were any recommendations on how, as a partner, someone who has a functional alcohol addiction can address that or deal with that.
I can answer that. I would recommend a book called Beyond Addiction, and the subtitle, I believe, is How Science and Kindness Help People Change. And it is evidence-based. It comes from the CRAFT model. That's Dr. Robert Meyer's work. He's a clinical psychologist out of the University of New Mexico. And the Center for Motivation and Change in New York has a great website, and they have a guide for parents and a guide for partners or spouses. And it's a highly respectful model that's based on communication skills and kind of reinforcing behaviors that you want to see and how to care for yourself in the face of the challenging aspects of it or the ones you don't want to participate in. And Dr. Myers wrote a book also. It's not as well written as Beyond Addiction, but it's called Get Your Loved Ones Sober. And the subtitle, every parent or spouse I've ever spoken to laughs when I tell them the subtitle, Alternatives to Nagging, Pleading, and Threatening, because they've all tried that unsuccessfully. So those are two books that I would recommend for partners or spouses or parents.
Thank you. Anybody else that would like to comment on that?
Well, I just want to say that shame has never helped me make the choice to change any behaviors that I am choosing to do. And it actually corrodes the part of my brain, like Brene Brown says, it corrodes the part of our brain that helps us think about a solution around something, you know, like it keeps you stuck. It doesn't help motivate change. I might suggest that if a partner wants some support around from a 12-step perspective, you know, they could explore the Al-Anon potentially, you know, just to go take a no thank you bite, even if you don't ever want to go back again. Like, it might be worth exploring if that's something that could be helpful for them.
I did Al-Anon probably for 5 years. I'm the sober child and the sober the goody two shoes, and I found Al-Anon not only helpful in terms of dealing with family members who had addictions, but just in terms of having really good skills and boundaries in life. And one of my best friends also did Al-Anon in her 20s. And I have to say, like, our 20s were really different than our friends because we did Al-Anon, and not that we were good at boundaries then, but at least we were thinking about them. and so, you know, making sure, like, I like the phrase of making sure your side of the fence is cleaned up before you go and clean up somebody else's side of the fence, and getting your own support first.
You know, also if a person finds themselves in a position where maybe they're taking on too much of somebody else's addiction, you know, I know it can be seen as a negative word, or like, I don't want to explore that because that sounds like horrible, but Codependency Anonymous could be something to explore too, because that can help strengthen my boundaries if I'm seeking help. It can help me know where I stop and someone else starts, and help me get strong, which is really all I can control anyways. I can't make anyone else do anything. I've tried with teenagers, I've tried with my dog, like, it just backfires. So all I can do is change me, and often it's interesting how things change when I change me.
And there's a couple of good codependency books that we'll put on the list as well.
I believe Pat Denning may have a new book about families and that kind of thing. And she has written 2 of the major books on harm reduction. So it's a harm reduction approach to spouses and children. And
Nice. Other
Smart Recovery Meeting, Kristen, the Smart Recovery Meeting for friends and family that I mentioned. I believe those are taking place by Zoom right now. Nice. And then they do have a good workbook. So that, I know locally we have one that's happening by Zoom, so I can get you that info.
That would be great.
And just I'm just going to say, one of my students wrote a book called Balm. She developed something called Be a Loving Mirror, and she has a lot of fans and from it. So I haven't read the whole book, so I can't.
Yeah, anyway. But you'll give us the reference.
Yeah, I'll give you the reference. I would.
Yeah, we'll just post. We're just going to post a whole bunch of references because, as it was said earlier, like, You know, it takes a lot of preparation before you take a step, and having lots of different references and options. So in that moment of like, okay, I need, you know, this has gotten too tight and I'm willing to move my foot forward in this small way. Like there's something there, and there'll just be a list for people to do that.
Okay.
So is there anything else that we...
What about the quote that came in as a question?
Chance favors the prepared mind. And if the question was just, what do you think of that?
I'm in agreement.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, for those of you who have joined us, thank you so much for joining us for a live connectors meeting. To all my really good friends and resources, thank you so much for showing up. I really appreciate that. And come back next month. We're going to talk about the vagus nerve if you're interested.
Good.
Bye, everybody.